So we're here today to talk about Mixpanel, specifically, the whole process of what it takes to implement Mixpanel. It doesn't matter if you're doing it from scratch, the very first time, or if you did it once, maybe you didn't get the data you wanted, and now you want to fix it. So what went wrong in that process? A couple housekeeping notes. I am recording everything, video, audio. So after the webinar is done, either today or tomorrow, I'll just prepare the video. I'll grab the slides. Some of the slides have a couple links to relevant things I'll be mentioning, and I'll send that over to everyone who signed up for the webinar. So you can take notes, but the whole thing will be available as well. And in terms of schedule, I got about 45 minutes here of content that I'll cover straight. If you have any questions along the way, post them. I'll try and cover them as we go along. If not, we'll take the last 10-15 minutes at the end of this 1 hour slot we have here to go over those questions. And Zoom actually will let us do a little bit of screen share and stuff like that. So we can actually go maybe to your Mixpanel data or into some documents if you have those. So you can think about that as we go along. Okay. So a little about me. For those who don't know me, so my name is Ruben, and I'm the founder of Practical Analytics. And my background is actually as a front-end developer. I kind of started building websites when I was really young, when I was 15 or so. And I did a couple startups, a couple web apps, but a couple of years ago, I moved away from just 100% coding into a more marketing role, which I enjoy a little bit more. And it just so happens that I ended up in this analytics sort of in between. It tends to be a space that is heavily used by marketing teams, but it's really implemented by development teams. So it's common to see issues and miscommunication between those two teams and companies. And at Practical, we have really sort of specialized ourselves in helping set up analytics tools, specifically Google Analytics. We do a lot of work on Mixpanel and similar tools like Amplitude, Kissmetrics, Segment.com. These are likely some of the tools you have come across in your research efforts. And a lot of these tools are, of course, for product teams. The marketing teams tend to use them, but they tend to be very much geared for web app and mobile apps. Okay, so methodology. Just give me 1 second here. I'll just quickly double check the chat. Okay, we're good. So I'll just pause that along the way to check for any questions. So we have done now maybe about 20, 30 Mixpanel implementations, just Mixpanel. We have also done Segment.com and Amplitude and so on. And we develop a consistent methodology for how we go about it that tends to fix and capture a lot of the errors and mistakes that I tend to see in Mixpanel setups, either from clients who have Mixpanel data and they want to fix it, or just from regular people that I meet and they show me their data. So we have roughly 4 stages that we go through in the project. Metric discovery, the creation of a technical tracking plan, we implement and curate the data, and then there's some training and education. The number one question whenever I show this is how long does it take? Usually when companies come to me, they say, hey, we want Mixpanel. We need it next week, next month. So these are some rough timelines of how things have taken in the past. So metric and technical tracking plan is about a couple weeks each, maybe a week, depending on how fast you can schedule things and how fast you can go through things. The implement and the QA data process tends to be the longest unknown, right? It really depends on your development team. How much time can you allocate? Can you fit into the upcoming sprint? And in the training education part, maybe a couple weeks after, that part tends to be a little bit less important just because now you have the data, so now it's just a matter of going through those educational sessions. And for today's call, we're just going to dive into every step here. What happens? What do we do? What's going on during those 2 weeks? What are the deliverables out of each step? And what are some of the pitfalls that we can run into? So let's jump into metric discovery. So metric discovery is really an organization of why you want the data, right? It's really a business question, a business process. And this makes sense when you think about analytics data. Usually the need for it comes from a product team or maybe from a marketing team or a growth team. So there's some kind of business problem that needs to be solved. So the goal here is you want to figure out what questions you want to answer with your data. And this is not technical at all. And in fact, at this stage, we're usually not even talking about tools. It's not like we want to do this with Google Analytics or we want to do this with Mixpanel. It's really what do we want to answer? And the questions that come up here tend to be common among companies. What is the retention of our users? How do we improve it? What is the conversion rate of our onboarding funnel? And where do people drop off? How can we segment that? How can we slice that? What marketing channels or campaigns are driving signups? Those are all high-level business questions that we're going to cover in this stage. And this is a stage where you can bring together the product team, the growth team, sometimes the design team gets involved, the UX team, and everyone just has their own relevant questions that they want to get answered, and it can all be condensed here into a general guideline. And what we're doing here is we're actually creating a document. Some people call it a measurement plan. There's different formats for it. I'll show you a sort of Google Doc that I have used. But the plan has different sections, and it'll just get everyone on the same page, so to speak, literally and metaphorically. And this link here is actually by Avinash. He's quite popular around Google Analytics, and I think he was a Google Analytics evangelist. And this is how he goes about the document. The format that I use is very similar to his. I think he used an Excel instead of a Google Doc, but it's the same sort of questions. So the very first section of this plan is just business objectives. And this is where, I've talked about those questions from before, right? And here, our example on the image on the right, understand key product metrics such as retention, sign-up rates, and adoption, right? That's clear. It's business. There's nothing technical behind this. There's nothing specific to Mixpanel at this stage. But we know what the objectives are. And for some companies, they might be very focused on user acquisition, or they might be very focused on retention. So this just has to clarify what you want to do. Then there's a section that we call tactics and strategies. This tends to be helpful. For example, when I go through this section, I just want to understand what the company's doing right now, right? Are they running Facebook ads, Google ads? Do they have plans to run engagement campaigns? Do they want to send emails or text messages to bring back users to the app? What are the plans or the ideas around those business objectives from before, right? And this just has to guide what we need to figure out. So for example, if you want to use push notifications, then we need to ensure that Mixpanel is set up for that, assuming we're going to use that, right? For other companies, it doesn't matter. They don't need it, so we can skip it altogether. So this is just a general, almost like laundry list of all the things we want to do, marketing-wise or product-wise, and we'll see how that sort of falls over into the technical side of things later on. At the third section is what we would expect from some sort of analytics project. Now we're talking about metrics and KPIs. And this tends to be business dependent, right? So when we go through with this process, we start by brainstorming internally. It's always likely that companies have an idea of what metrics they want to track, right? They know there's a couple standard metrics, maybe sign-up rates, conversion rates, retention rates, things like that. I find it helpful to define it at this stage a little bit, to add a little bit of definition of what it means for your business. I have seen a lot of companies where they talk about retention, but the retention formula is very broad, very vague. So this is a good stage to put it here. So this is actually a good example of what a simple definition is, right? We have active customers or active users, which is a very, very common metric, especially for mobile apps. But here we defined it, right? So we say plus 1+ transaction in the current calendar time period, right? And this is, of course, relevant to this specific client, a specific app. But we start to add a little bit of definitions around the metrics. And when you come up with this list, you start to brainstorm internally to figure out what are those things that matter to you. You can also research some of the industry standards. So if you were to sort of just Google SaaS apps or SaaS metrics, actually, you would see sort of list of what are the common SaaS metrics that companies need to look at, right? So you can take your list, merge it with that list, and if you're venture funded or if you have investors, it's likely your investors also have a requirement of metrics they want to see, right? And you can sort of take all that together and distill it down into a list of metrics here. And here you might end up with 5, 10, 15 metrics, depending on how big your business is, how sophisticated you want to be to start with. Next, the next section we will cover is segments. And segments to me is actually where a lot of the magic happens of data. When we look at any metric, even if you go back, right, we take something like active customers, or perhaps actually number 8, total number of card loads. It's a very specific metric to this company. It's interesting to see that number and to start kind of see a trend over time, to see, hey, we had more card loads this month than last month, or this week than last week, and it's sort of trending upwards by 20%, 30%. That's sort of an interesting thing to see. But for the improvement process, for the actual how do we make the product better, how do we make the marketing better, segments is usually the answer to that. So we want to be able to take that metric and slice it, right, and segment it down. And that means, of all those card loads, what are the lead channels that those users came from, or marketing channels in this case, right? Was it mostly Facebook users that are doing those card loads, or is it another type of marketing channel? For companies that are, for example, cross-platform, that might be an issue, right? Maybe you have more iOS card loads than Android. So the segments is how we want to start to break down that data. And you can start with customer segments, which tend to be things like geographic, the city, the region, the country. For some companies, demographic data might be relevant, gender, age, and so on. But then a lot of the work will actually be very specific to your product, right? And we could just call this customer attributes. And you'll see this a lot. Mixpanel calls those people properties. So this is where things start to tie together. But it's likely that in your product, you have very specific attributes for your customers that matter to you, right? So in this case, in this example, everything from 8 downward are actually very specific attributes for this product, right? So they were, saying of where the card was loaded, right? Was it a store? Was it online? Was it direct deposit? So brainstorming what are those attributes that matter to your product. Some common things that seem to be consistent around products are things like user role, right? Is it an admin user or is it an end user that got invited? Plan type, right? For example, if you're a SaaS company and they sign up for a free plan, or maybe they sign up for a free trial of a paid plan, just try to gauge what plan they're on whenever they're completing actions. We can also set up actions themselves as attributes. So for example, we have this idea of a card load, right? They're loading a card. This is actually a debit card. We could set up an attribute that says how many cards they have, right? Maybe they have 2 active cards. So that could be an attribute that then we can segment everything else around that. So segments is all that. So you can put it here, and the idea is that segments and metrics tend to play together. So you'll segment the metrics by what you listed here. Not everything will be one-on-one. Some segments and some metrics will not interlock, but this is a good brainstorming area for everything that'll be relevant for your product. And lastly, we have a report section. This area is just good to start organizing metrics and segments and all that around some logical reports. The format of this report is not here. I just want to make a note of that. This might end up being something inside Mixpanel or something inside Google Analytics or maybe even a spreadsheet. But we just want to say, okay, roughly what are those sort of handful of reports we want to look at, right? We may want to have something around user acquisition, something around general product behavior, and maybe retention. So we start to organize things into some logical structure. You might even just have one general report that has your sort of 5-10 metrics that you want to track. And then we'll come here and eventually kind of fill this out with a little bit more detail and go on. Okay. So that's the metric discovery. Before I go on, a few more comments here. The way I tend to go through this when I hop in is, I'll come into a client and I don't know the product, right? I don't know the web app, I don't know the mobile app, I don't know the business. So we'll start by scheduling just a metric discovery call, right? And those calls, I'll be running the client through the sections, right? So I'll be saying, what are the business objectives? Why that? Why this? What are some of the tactics and strategies you're using? What are the metrics that matter to you? So all these things, the client has to have a good idea of what they want. We're trying to understand the product. What is the positioning of the product? Who are the customers? Why did they use the product? For me, there's a sort of a high learning curve that I have to take on for the product before I can sort of fill out this document. And of course, in my case, I can bring a little bit of experience and say, hey, for the metrics, I have seen similar businesses track this. But you can also do the same by doing a little bit of research. So we'll go through 1 or 2 phone calls where we tend to bring everyone who has a say in the data, who's going to use the data, right? So we'll have people from product, from growth, from design, and so on in this call, and everyone will just be throwing their suggestions and their ideas, and we'll come up with a sort of final document that everyone can say, yeah, my metrics are there, or my questions are going to be answered because they're in that document. And that process takes about 1 or 2 weeks. On the short end, you'll have to sort of schedule things very quickly, right? Schedule the meetings and the calls, go through it, get some feedback, and finalize it. So 2 weeks tends to be a sort of comfortable timeline for this. Okay, so we finished this section, the metric discovery, and now we have this sort of Google Doc or spreadsheet with all the metrics and things that are sort of our plan of what we want to track and what we want to measure. So we can jump into the technical tracking plan, which is where we're really start talking about Mixpanel in detail. So before I do that, let me double check for any questions. Okay, we are good. So technical tracking plan is it's sort of it feels like a little bit of a fancy word, but it's really a spreadsheet that just contains all the events and properties and things you want to track inside something like Mixpanel. And the goal here is we want to convert this measurement plan that we just spent some time creating into actual instructions for the development team, right? You can't really hand this measurement plan to developers because they just won't know how to implement it, right? The instructions for the developers have to be quite clear to ensure that their time isn't wasted. And in almost every company, development time is quite precious. So we want to make things as easy as possible for the development team. A general rule of thumb is, the better structured this document is, the more time you spend on this document, the easier it will be for your developers to implement the data, right? So I think I've done a lot of work and talk around this sort of plan. And quite consistently, whenever clients come to me that they have existing data that they're not happy with, I tend to find that either there wasn't a tracking plan created at all, or the plan they created was very weak. Like it was very light on the details. And that sort of makes sense when you look at the outcome, right? So let me hop on here and actually show you what the plan looks like. So this is a template that I like to use, and this is actually a fully completed template. You'll find templates, Mixpanel has their own template, Segment.com has their own template, I think Amplitude has their own template, Kissmetrics probably has their own template. All the templates are roughly similar. I don't think there's anything fancy about any template, including myself. The point is they use one. You can even create your own if you wanted to. But what we have here is let's start with actually from section D. So when I complete this template, once again, I got in a sort of this crash course in the product of the business. Now I'm going through the app. I need to become familiar with the app. So as I go along with the app, I just divide that app into general sections, product sections, right? This is the sign up part. This is the onboarding part. This is the general features part, like the profile setup part. And what I'm doing here is I'm capturing all the little actions that users can take as they go along. So you can imagine, I'll download the mobile app, or I'll open the web app on my browser, and I'll sign up like a regular user. And as I go along, I'm taking a note. I'm making a note of all the little actions that I have to take. So for example, this company has a common setup here where to sign up, you can either sign up by email or you can sign up via LinkedIn, right? A social authentication. So when you sign up via LinkedIn, you sort of have 2 steps to your sign up, right? You click authenticate via LinkedIn, and then you authenticate successfully, right? So I tend to divide that here, right? So I have a sign up started and like a sign up completed, just to cover those 2 steps. And then I'll go on and on, covering all the other little actions. I confirm my account. This is a messaging app, a career messaging app actually. So there's some work around messages. So I can build message, I can start message, and so on and so on. So this way, you tend to see. These are all the little actions. So the command I see is if you don't take this sort of logical step through the app or logical walkthrough through the app, you might end up with just the high level actions. So if you know your product very well, you can sort of come in here and just dump things into this document. You can say, okay, obviously people sign up. That's one event. They add a device. They add this. So you can come up with events like that, but you'll miss some of the little things and the details. So going through a walkthrough through the app like a regular user would tends to give you a lot more data. Now, as we go through it, what I'm capturing here, and this plan is actually for segment.com. It's actually this actually was a segment.com/Mixpanel plan. So we see words like traits here, but the main column of this document is actually right here. So we have the events, right? The event name. We're gonna have a logic of when the event fires, some properties for that event, so event properties, and then the people properties, which are the user attributes from Mixpanel. I also tend to add some notes here. This is just technical notes for the developers. And sometimes it can be helpful to add the API. If you're not a developer yourself, this actually might be quite tricky to do yourself, of course. But this is usually not helpful. The developers can usually figure out how to do it. But what we're capturing here is we're saying these are all the events that we want to fire. These are all the properties for each relevant event. And these are all the people properties that we want to set along the way, right? So now we can grab our measurement plan. We know we have a rough idea of what we want to track metric-wise, segment-wise, and so on. And I'll take that and go through the app. Sort of have this walkthrough through the app, making a note of every little thing that users can do. They can change the setting, they can turn that on, they can turn that off. Everything will just get thrown here along the way. And at each step, for example, when a user starts to sign up, I'll then say, okay, is there anything else that can be collected here, right? Is there anything else that can tell me more about this action of starting to sign up? And that will start to inform the properties. So here we have a property called authentication type, which just simply says, how did the user authenticate? Was it LinkedIn or was it email? When they complete the sign up, right? We know, we complete the sign up, we end up in some sign up success page. Same thing, right? We'll know we're going to have the property. We want to find, okay, how did they authenticate? And at this stage, we'll also say, we also want to know what's the user type here, right? Did they select it to be an admin? Are they a user? Or maybe there's something else, right? In that process, going action by action and answering the question about what's relevant here, what else can we collect, that tends to be how you complete this plan, right? So if you just do this off the top of your head, it's almost guaranteed you're going to miss some things, right? Because some things you will only notice them once you're actually in the interface, right? Once you're like, oh yeah, they could upload a picture. Oh yeah, and they also have like this 4 or 5 settings when they upload a picture, right? They can choose like a filter, or they can choose this, or they can tag some people, right? That's sort of what Instagram will be like. So we should definitely collect that along the way when they upload a picture, right? We also at each stage, we can also set some people properties, right? So the people properties are just user attributes from Mixpanel, right? And we'll jump a little bit to Mixpanel to talk about it, but a user attribute is just things like city, like region, like country. They just tend to be profile information about that user. Just like anything else, we tend to set people properties as we go along, right? So whenever we do something, we'll set it. So we take this example here, sign up completed. We know after they sign up, now we have some information about that user, right? We now know their first name, their last name. We know what plan they're on. We know how they authenticated. So we can set those here at the relevant time, right? And you'll see something similar with other events. Let's see, find something smaller here. We know this is a messaging career app, so when they build a message they want to send, we can also set a people property to say, hey, how many messages has this user built over time, right? So as we go through it, we're saying, what are the actions that users can take here? What's the action that users taken? What are some most relevant properties that we want? And is there any people properties that we want to set here, right? Do we want to track how many times they have done this action? Or maybe it's something like they changed their email, so we now need to change the email in Mixpanel, right? And we go back up to our original example. And then you'll see, in between parentheses, I tend to put some sample values here. And the sample values actually are quite helpful for the developers because it sort of provides context for what we were talking about here. Because you might end up with a property name that's obscure, or maybe that's not the development team might call it something else. But with the values, they can sort of connect the dots. So let me hop back over here. And that link is actually for a blank track. It's actually the same plan template here I have here. But like I said, there's a few templates out there online, so you can find the one that you like the most. So let's say one more thing on the instructions. So you tend to go through it. You'll go through the whole app, and you might end up with, depending on how big your app is, 20, 30 actions that users can take inside your app, from the major things like signups to really minor things like settings and like enabling to turn enough notifications, right? There's some things that you'll look at them and you're like, this is irrelevant. It doesn't matter to our product, and you're right. So what we'll do right after is then we'll prioritize everything, right? So we'll just have priorities 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however many you want, and that will be the process at which we'll implement the data, right? How you figure out the priorities will actually depend on your measurement plan. So once you have your actions, you can then say, okay, we want this metric called card loads. So to figure that out, we need to set up the event called card loaded that that fires whenever a user loads the card, right? So you start to match things up like that. And ideally, your priority one should be a relatively small implementation, maybe 5, 10, maybe 15 events, right? You want to give the development team something small to start with. They can become familiar with Mixpanel. They can get it right. They can ensure the data is accurate. And then you can actually come on and say, okay, now we're going to do priority 2 and then priority 3 and so on. And it's common that you might never get to some priorities because just the events are so minor and so irrelevant. But it's helpful to have it in the plan, right? It's much easier to start with a lot and then sort of come down than to start with too little and then go up, because there's some things you might miss. So just some tips and tricks on this document. This document is actually quite critical to everything Mixpanel related, right? And as I mentioned, whenever this document is not present in the implementation, it tends to be a very big sign or a big warning sign that something will not go well. Little things that might not matter too much to you, but actually matter a lot to the development team is the logic when the event should fire, right? And that's why we have something like this. And you'll see it as sort of almost obvious for some events, others less obvious, right? But fire when the user starts the register process by clicking the sign up with LinkedIn button or the general sign up button under the form asking for a name and email, right? I would say almost any developer can read this and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. And that's what you want. You want the logic to be extremely obvious here, because there'll be some events where you'll find that there could be multiple ways to do the event. So you just want to make sure that it fires only when you're expecting it to fire. So this logic tends to help a lot. The other thing, a consistent naming convention. So a naming convention is just simply the structure of your event names or your property names, right? So here we can see that everything here is lowercase. So it simply means that all the words are lowercase and they're converted to lowercase. You could do something like this, right? Like that would be like capital case. You could do something like camel case. You could probably do like underscore case, right? Something like that. There's no better naming convention. There's nothing that's better or worse. The key thing is to be consistent for a couple reasons. One, Mixpanel is case sensitive, which means that if you start sending an event called signup started, lowercase, and then you eventually move to something like this, that's completely different to Mixpanel, and it'll sort of break your data, right? Mixpanel just assumes that this capital case thing is completely new. So being consistent will help. I also find that it's easier to read if you're consistent. So if you have one event like this and another event that's capital case, another event that's like underscore, is sort of kind of weird and confusing as to why they're spelled differently. So just pick one and use it across the board. I like to use lowercase. I have found that it seems to be easier for the development team to maintain. Maybe because they can sort of force everything to be lowercase, but they can force anything to be anything. So just pick one and stick with it. And ideally, you can use it across everything. So you can use it across the event names, the property names, the people properties, and so on. And since we're doing a spreadsheet, we can actually go through editing here. And when I create these plans, even though I've done a lot of Mixpanel implementations, I'll still go through 2 or 3 editing rounds. So I'll start by throwing everything on the page, Then I'll edit down, and when I'm editing, what I'm doing is I'm really condensing things, right? So I might have 2 events that are roughly the same. Maybe, let's say, maybe a user can upload a photo and they can upload a video. But they're doing roughly the same action, right? They're uploading some kind of media. So I might say, you know what, that I don't think it makes sense to have that in 2 different events. Let me just create a new event called upload media, and I'll use a property. They'll call it type or media type, and I'll just say photo or video, right? So that way I'm able to go from 2 events to just 1 more global event. That has to be part of the editing process. You don't want to go too global. I've seen companies where they go from specific actions to saying, well, this is obviously a product action. So I'm just going to create an event called product, and I'm going to have like a property that says what type of product action they're doing. I think that's a little bit too broad. Ideally, the events are logical. So they say, hey, this is clearly they're uploading something, and I know they can upload a photo or video. Maybe eventually they can upload something else. So that's part of the editing process. The other little thing I tend to do in the editing process is to become consistent in the properties, right? So this is a great example here. These are 2 different events around sign up, but they can authenticate via, the authentication is still the same. It's either LinkedIn or email. So we can actually use the same property here, right? So we use authentication type and authentication type here. I've seen cases where, it'll be authentication type here, and then here it'll be like type authentication. For some reason, it's like a different property. It's the same thing, right? So use the same property, and you can kind of clearly see that in a spreadsheet. You can see where, oh yeah, that's the same property we have used before. Let me use the same naming structure. Things like that. But yeah, so you go through the editing in this document, you get cleaned up, you get prioritized, and then you can pass it on to a development team who will take the Mixpanel docs, and then go implement it. Okay. So let me go back here into full screen. So now we got this technical plan. We got a measurement plan that flew into the tracking plan, and now we're ready to implement data. So this part is actually relatively straightforward. There's usually not a lot of questions, not a lot of issues that come up here, assuming your plan is correct, right? If your plan is correct, if your plan is clear, makes sense, then this part will be really easy. The goal here is just to implement the priority 1 events from your tracking plan. How long that will take, again, it'll come up here. It will depend on development time, right? How quickly can your developers move to get the plan implemented? But let me answer some common questions around implementations. This questions that come up from the development team, more or less than the business team. Question 1, should we do a client side? Should we do a server side? And by the way, if you're not technical, this part might not seem as relevant, but you can sort of share this slide with your development team when the time is right. So on the client side versus server side debate, a long time ago I would do multi-client side. I'm a front-end developer after all. But these days, really the split has become more 80-20. That means 80-20 server side and 20% client side. So what does it mean to be client side? It usually means using JavaScript libraries, the iOS or Android libraries, and server side usually means using some on the server, like Ruby or Python or PHP or something. The reason why the split is like this, it tends to be because of how apps are developed and how apps have changed, right? It's not very common to have a company that has a product that's available on web, on iOS, and on Android. So if you go 100% client, it means you literally have to rewrite everything for 3 platforms, right? So all the actions users can take have to be written for web on JavaScript, then they have to be rewritten for iOS, and then once again for Android, sort of like 3 times the work. But as we can see, the actions are probably very similar. So what users can do on the Android app or on the iOS app is probably similar to what they can do on a web app. Maybe not 100% the same, but similar. So it makes much more sense to take all those common actions, right? The kind of actions that can take place across multiple platforms, and implement those through a server side library. So capture those on the server. On the server, you can also capture where it's coming from. So you could capture, this action took place on the iOS app, it took place on the Android app, and you can store that. And then the 20% on the client side is actually tends to be things like authentication, like user identification, which is actually number 2. So we cover that. So the hardest part, or the things where people get stuck the most, and actually Mixpanel has confirmed the similar from their support, is identifying users. So identifying users means that you want to track the users. And this is why people want Mixpanel, right? You want the profiles. You want to be able to look at data at an individual level, not just an anonymous global level like Google Analytics. So to do this, you have to really understand how to use 2 things: Mixpanel Alias and Mixpanel Identify. That link I provided there is actually a help doc from Mixpanel that will explain that in more detail. I won't go completely into detail. If you have a question in the Q&A, I can cover that. But the user identification process of that code should happen client side, right? So that will happen on JavaScript, on iOS, and Android, and that tends to make up the bulk of the 20% that I'm talking about, right? Versus the rest is 80%. So a lot of implementations I have done recently, they really have been like this. Almost every event around actions, like the things you saw in the plan before, like building the messages and even like the logins and logouts, stuff like that. A lot of stuff we threw that to the server side, and we just made sure the user identification parts, those were on the client side. Right. How many events should I implement first? As I mentioned before, I would say 5 to 15 could be a good priority one. I find most analytics tools tend to, even Mixpanel, I think they have a help doc somewhere. They'll say you should do like 3 or 5. And it's been consistent like 3 or 5. I think segment.com says the same thing. I used to say 3 or 5 too, but I don't think I've ever done a single implementation where we have done 3 or 5 events on the very first pass, on like the priority one. So I don't say that anymore because I think 3 or 5 might be a little bit too little. And I find that from the company's perspective, they're saying, we're putting all this time and effort on making these documents. We're carving out development time that we can use to prove the product. We're not just going to go through 3 or 5, right? We're gonna do much more. You don't want to do too much because it's the more events you add, the more you have to maintain, the more you have to do things. But 3 or 5 might be a little bit too low. So 5 or 15 could be good, and 5 or 15 events, it's usually enough to cover all the sign up, the onboarding, key product actions, and retention. So you can usually, through 5 or 15 events, you should be able to really capture almost everything in the product around those 4 areas. And there might be some little things that you might not have, but you should get quite a bit, right? So if you have, if you're way off, if you have like 40 events that you need to implement to get those 4 actions, it might mean that you need to condense those events more. You need to consolidate them into more global events until you get down to 5 or 15 really core events. Okay, how to QA data. There is no automatic way to QA data, at least not yet, or at least not that I haven't used so far. The way we QA data is really using 2 reports in Mixpanel. Hop on here to Mixpanel here. So report 1 is live view. So if you open this report here, this simply just shows you all the events coming in real time. So the moment you take an event on an app, you'll see it come up. So we can see all the events here, and you can of course filter this down by your city, right? So if you're somewhere, you can just sort of go to Vancouver, like I am, and you get to see only your events from whenever they happen. So when you're here, you can just sort of click an event. That's actually a good event. Here, like this event, and you get to see your properties, right? The custom things you added, and the sort of the Mixpanel default properties, right? So the way you QA data is you take your plan and you say, okay, we implemented all this like events, mark 1. We have an event called sign up completed, and we should have 2 properties. So we go there and we go see if if it has 2 properties, does it have the right value, is it the right naming convention, and so on and so on. So you can actually pass this on to your QA team and just give them those instructions. So the events, you have the right data, and the second report that we use to QA things is actually the Explorer user report. So let me open that as a new window. And then here, you can just once the user gets created in Mixpanel, so once that user identification process happens, you should be able to find the user here. It's somewhere in here, right? So I'm sure if I can find myself, I'll probably see myself there. And you should be able to then open it. See if this is the right one. Nope, not the right one. I think Mixpanel slow then. Wait, okay. But once it loads, you'll have the once it loads, you get to see all the events that are attached to your user, and you also get to see the people properties or the user attributes, which are this, right? We know these are sort of the properties that we'll see. And it looks like the Mixpanel is stuck. Not good. So as you go along, you get to see the properties and the people properties, and you should be able to refresh the page and so on and see all this data come in, right? And it should match whatever's on your plan, right? So that's really the QA process. There's nothing fancy to it. It's making sure that events aren't being sent twice. It's making sure that things are getting set properly with the right values. Common things, actually you saw before, my name was there twice on that list. So ensuring that doesn't happen because users are getting created twice. So all those little things you should capture in those two reports, the live view and the user explorer. And your developers can likely do a little bit of QA, but it's also helpful to have some of the business teams actually QA the data, and that just also gets them it gets them familiar with data. Okay, so we got a few minutes here. So we got the data implemented now. It's QA'd. We got priority 1 events done. So likely between 5 and 15 events. The last day is just training and education. The goal here is quite straightforward. We just want to get everyone in the company or everyone who needs to get access to the Mixpanel data to start using the data, right? The bigger your team is, the harder this is because now you have multiple teams. You have to roll this out. If you only have 3 or 4 people, it's just a little easier. But what I tend to do here is quite simple. We'll do 1 or 2 company-wide sessions where it'll be a general crash course on Mixpanel on all the relevant Mixpanel reports. And of course, as we go through it, we're looking at, again, the measurement plan from the very beginning because we have, remember we have business objectives. And now we want to say, okay, here's that one business objective. Here's that one metric we wanted. This is how we sort of look at that inside Mixpanel, right? So you want tie everything together back to that original measurement plan. This sort of actions are something called workflows. So what's the workflow, right? So if you're a product and you want to understand retention, what's your workflow? What are the different reports and things you're going to go through as you work through your data? You can go through those examples. Now the assumption here is that if you're doing the company-wide sessions or the one-on-ones where you're sitting down with someone on the product team and just looking at their specific questions. The assumption here is that you're a Mixpanel power user. So someone in the company has to become that Mixpanel power user, right? And that leads us a little bit to roles. What are kind of some of the internal roles that we can set up for maintaining the data? And this is really not Mixpanel specific, but if you start with Mixpanel, then this will be relevant to Mixpanel. Eventually, this will grow to other tools. But the roles that tend to be set up are 2 roles at the minimum, maybe 3 if your company is big enough. One is having the business lead, and that's just having someone who owns the data, and that includes any additions to the data, right? So as you add new things to the product, you may want to track that. So having someone on the business side who's responsible for that and say, okay, we added this new feature. Here's that new event, the new event properties and people properties in the tracking plan. This is what we're going to implement, right? This person is likely going to be your Mixpanel power user, right? Who everyone comes for questions. Then you have a technical lead. And this is someone, a developer, who's going to be responsible for the implementation. Maybe they might not do the implementation themselves because maybe they're on the web and you need some iOS changes and so on. But they ideally should lead the implementation. They should own the implementation, so to speak, right? And in bigger companies, you might have an executive lead who sort of owns the project as a whole and just provides resources, right? And removes roadblocks, so to speak. So setting up these 3 roles will ensure that your data stays accurate. If you don't, then what's going to happen is you have a product release and the data might break in some little way and no one will really know this, and it'll break again and again and again, and eventually 3 months later the data no one will trust it because it's broken and no one knows how to fix it and so on. So that business lead and the technical lead tend to work in tandem to ensure that no matter what happens, the data is accurate. And anything new that needed to be added was added. As QA is accurate and all that. So perfect. And looks like finished for just a couple minutes. A couple next steps. I've been playing around with this idea. So I tend to do those sort of longer 4 or 6 week projects. But I've been playing around with the idea of using audit calls. These are short calls that tend to be an hour long. And they tend to be quite interesting because they can sort of guide you along and anywhere in the process. So, because some companies tend to be maybe in step 2 and step 3, or maybe they start from scratch. So instead of starting to create something specific to that, so instead of saying, hey, this is a tracking plan call, this is like a measurement plan call, this other calls have to be pretty broad. So each call is an hour, and they're actually they're $300. So if that's something that could be helpful for your team, there's a link here, and I'll post in the chat as well. Some of the past calls, you can see that the topics have actually been quite varied, right? So maybe create a tracking plan, but you're not sure if it's correct, right? Does it need more editing? Or maybe you have some data in Mixpanel, but no one's using it, right? What's the problem there? So there's definitely a lot of different things that could be covered in this other calls. And they can sort of guide you along on where you need to go. Perfect. So we do have about 5-10 minutes here, and I can answer any questions if you have any. So let me go here. So while I sort of get set up here, let me know if everyone has any questions, and you can post them in the chat. Yeah, you post them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. Yes. So question here, where does goal and target setting come in the process before tech implementation? I assume you're talking about goals and targets for metrics. Yes, there's actually a section in the measurement plan for targets that I skipped. I didn't cover. But your measurement plan could have a target section. And that just means, hey, we have retention. This is how we define retention, and this is our goal for retention. This is what we're striving to hit. So you can add that in the measurement plan for sure. And that will also guide you. And that, I find for a lot of companies, they don't have that as detailed as it should. They haven't thought enough, okay, what is the benchmark that we want to hit? But going through that does give you a good sense of where you are, right? It gives you a sense of what you should be working on or what you can skip. So that's something you can throw in the measurement plan. Okay, let's give it a couple more minutes. I think I'll stop sharing. There we go. One thing that actually I will cover, dumbest mistake. So what's the dumbest mistake you see people commonly make with Mixpanel implementations? The most common thing is actually using Mixpanel as a page view tracker. So I find a lot of companies might be coming from Google Analytics, and Google Analytics is, of course, page view driven. And you look at everything as a page. So the page loads, and what happened in that page, and bounce rate, and so on. Those all come from page views. So it's common to then see that sort of idea and bring it to Mixpanel and just say, well, we're just going to fire one event called page view, and that would just give us everything we need, and then we'll build funnels off that. And I've seen that, and a lot of times it's sort of like, actually, I remember seeing that just a couple of weeks ago, where they, it's a web app, and they had it's a normal web app, so technically every time the user does something, the page loads. So theoretically, it could make sense. But then you don't really have any data, right? You're sort of missing a lot of things. And it's really hard to build funnels. It's really hard to get a lot of Mixpanel out of it. You're really stuck by just looking at, like, what are the most popular pages, which doesn't really translate to things. So I think moving into the event setup, which is what Mixpanel was set up for, is the way to go. Otherwise, you just don't get any value out of it. So And I find those companies where they're stuck with page views, then they'll be like, I just don't understand Mixpanel. It doesn't seem that helpful because we got this page views, but they didn't have the right data inside Mixpanel. So define development support is limited, and you need to prioritize implementation, or you select clients only based on development resources. I find that's so development support historically hasn't been an issue. It might take a little bit longer, maybe a week or two to find it, but it always gets implemented. I find that when companies reach out to me, that it tends to be a priority enough that they'll be able to select that time. I think I had one project where we had some major issues. So I don't select clients based on development resources. It's sort of a little bit hard to find as well. Next, is there a smart way to marry MP's people-centric review JS user's ID? There actually is. So for those who don't know, Google Analytics doesn't let you send personal information into it. So things like names and emails are not allowed, unlike Mixpanel where you can store all this. But when we identify users in Mixpanel, we actually tend to use, or at least the best way to identify those users, the ID for those users should actually be a database ID, right? Some companies use emails as a way to set up people in Mixpanel, but that's not the most reliable way. So you can actually send that. You can send the same ID to Mixpanel. You can send the same ID to Google Analytics, assuming that it's a database ID, and that will let you match it up. And Google Analytics does have what they call the User Explorer report. And in the User Explorer, you can actually drill down into a specific user, into a specific profile, and then you can see all those actions that the user took. So in theory, you could take the same database ID that's in Mixpanel and that's in Google Analytics and go find that same user. The only challenge for you would be filtering Google Analytics enough to find that. Because I don't think there's no search in Google Analytics for users. I'm trying to remember. So you have to sort of make the pile small enough until you can find that user. But it should be theoretically possible. What can be migrated from Google Tag Manager over to Mixpanel? So Google Tag Manager is a way to load tags on the website. You could implement Mixpanel through Google Tag Manager, and I've done a couple of projects like that. What tends to happen here is that, once again, if we look at that sort of server-side, client-side split that I talk about, then really there shouldn't be a lot of Google Tag Manager because most of it should be in the back end. So the answer here would be, yeah, you can use them together. You likely want to, if you're going to migrate away from Google Tag Manager, I assume you're going to migrate into the server side, which just be a much better setup for web apps anyway. Yes, I think that. Let me know the answer to these questions. Yeah, they're not opposites, right? So they can sort of play together. It's not like you have to use one or the other. It just Google Tag Manager wasn't really designed for Mixpanel. It was really designed for the Google products like Google Analytics and AdWords and all those. Okay, I think I'll take one more question. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to mention before. I think it was all the questions came in, which was segment.com. I didn't cover in this process, but it's quite popular these days. And for almost every project that I do these days, I almost always recommend using segment.com, and I'll post a link here if you guys haven't seen that. The rough process of segment.com, if you haven't come across it, is that it becomes your one implementation. So if you have multiple tools that get the same data, so let's say you have Mixpanel, Intercom, Customer IO, and so on. They can all receive events with event properties and like user attributes. It's the same idea. It could sometimes be a challenge if you're going to implement them multiple times. So if you do it once for Mixpanel and then you do it once for Intercom and you do it once for Customer IO. So segment.com was meant to solve that problem by saying, hey, let's do it once. Let's send it once to segment.com, and then we'll send it over to, we'll translate and convert it for Intercom and Mixpanel and all that. So it helps you with development time. So you do it once and you don't have to do it multiple, and you can send it to multiple tools. So if you're considering segment.com, my recommendation would be, yeah, you can do one last question, yeah. My recommendation would be use it if your budget can afford it, right? You run the numbers, if your budget can afford it, use it, just because it will make your life easier in the long term, right? So right now you may be interested in Mixpanel, but you might eventually outgrow it, right? You might want to move to Amplitude, which is the sort of nemesis of Mixpanel these days. It's quite a good tool. So that moving away from Mixpanel to Amplitude might mean that you have to rewrite all your code, which is a bit of a hassle. But if you do it with segment.com from the start, then you can skip the rewriting, and you can just sort of turn it on and off in the UI. So this would be a good solution for a long-term investment anyway. And I think there's one more question just as we wrap up here. Where can she pull a switch? Yeah, so Heap Analytics is they're actually doing quite well. I think they're in Series C. So Heap Analytics methodology is track everything, and then you sort down later. The common issues, and interesting enough, of course, the Mixpanel and the segment.coms of the world, they actually don't believe in that philosophy. So it's sort of philosophical is a different approach. I find the Heap Analytics makes the setup really easy. I don't do any work around Heap Analytics. Obviously, there's no work to be done there. It's just implemented. That's it, for the most part. What tends to happen is when we look at a plan, the plan that I showed you, if you remember, there were, some events can have a lot of properties, right? And you might end up with having an event or an action that has like 10 different properties, event properties. And sometimes a lot of the data is just not there. It's just not in the interface. It's just, you sort of have to calculate to figure it out. So I find with that methodology of just tracking everything and then sorting later, there's a lot of pieces of data that you'll be missing, right? Like there'll be some properties that just weren't there, they're not collected, so you can't really segment it, you can't really analyze them. And I find that they also lead to that. It can also lead to bad setups because you don't do the thought process. I find a lot of the sort of the magic of getting Mixpanel right comes from doing the measurement plan and thinking it through and just spending even a few minutes being like, oh yeah, this is the business objectives, this is the metrics, here's our benchmarks, here's our segment, that sort of thought process. But if you don't do that, it can be easy to just skip it altogether. So that's one challenge with that. That just you'll be missing data. The second would be that you might not have some of the thought process that can lead to a successful use of the data. And then of course, I know Heap, for example, doesn't support Android. They do iOS, but they don't do Android. So anyway, so it can be a good start. If you have a web app, it can give you some data, but I think eventually you'll need to upgrade to a more event-driven methodology, whether it's Mixpanel or Amplitude, or you do it yourself. I guess that doesn't really matter as much. Perfect. So I think that's it, and we're just on time. So I will shut it down here. Thanks, everyone. I will, I'll record this video, I'll send it over by email, send over the slides, links, all that will be in that one single email. And if you have any questions, you can let me know by email. All right, thanks guys. Have a good afternoon.